First of all, I'd like to thank the co-authors of the original paper, Randy Snyder, Lubia Berlikova, Sasha Karatea from Buffalo State College. A lot of this research that I'm going to be presenting is based on projects funded by the GLRI, so I'd certainly like to acknowledge their support for this. Basically, this project, actually these projects were initiated out of informal discussions at a workshop. Being fellow fish folk, we were kind of interested in, all right, we've already had experience with the gobies and other species, and the question that remained was, is there a chance for more potentially invasive species coming from the Ponto-Caspian area? So what I'm going to do today, those of you that have seen previous iterations of this presentation, it's going to be a little bit different because there's been some new and updated information that I'm going to be presenting. So initially, I'm going to summarize the original study from Snyder et al. In 2014, review the ballast transport risk of 10 Ponto-Caspian species, which were identified as high impact species should they get introduced into the Great Lakes. And we will, based on the new information, revise a list of the high-risk invasive species based on some of this new information. Now, if we take a look at this grossly oversimplified model of ballast invasions, we see this is largely a gauntlet. And in order to proceed from one stage to the next, certainly physiological and life history and ecological characteristics have to be just right for these species to be successful invaders. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of information on the life stages, the seasonality of these life stages, and their densities in home ports. But we do know that the ability for species to be transported successfully by ballast water, this door is closing because of improved mechanisms in ballast water management, ballast water exchange, the amount of compliance, the shipping industry, and inspections. So I think as a mechanism for transport of invasive species from the Ponto-Caspian and other area, it hasn't closed completely, but it is becoming a less effective vector. Along with the ballast water management, I think there are some other questions that need to be answered, and that pertains specifically to the salinity tolerances, acute versus chronic salinity tolerances. So in other words, if a ship is exchanging ballast, that sudden change in salinity being an acute one, will that be an effective way of killing species immediately versus a long-term exposure to high salinity environments? Now, some very interesting work has come out looking at concept of propic Joule pressure, which is basically equivalent to introduction effort. And this information is based on potential ballast introduction frequency from home ports, which contains some of these high-risk species. And this is some new work from McIsaac et al. In 2015. Some very, very good information here that I'll also be presenting. So we do know that the Ponto-Caspian area of Eurasia is a very species-rich area and responsible for numerous invasions to the Great Lakes. However, directly from the Ponto-Caspian area, there's really a surprising small amount of shipping that actually comes to the Great Lakes. Instead, because of canals and shipping and other vectors, a lot of these species have made their way to Baltic and European ports, which are more similar environmentally to the Great Lakes and are thus the larger source region for some of these invasive species. Now, part of the problem in trying to understand potential impacts and ecology of some of these potential invasive species is the language barrier. And there's been a number of efforts underway trying to make predictive models of what species could be next. But again, the language barrier was simply strong enough that not enough information could be derived. So the original study by Snyder et al. Was an extension of earlier work by Kohler and Lodge, which analyzed the invasive potential of some 66 species. And in the Snyder study, there was some newly translated information compiled for 42 additional species. Now, actually, two of our Russian researchers on the original project team actually went to the former Soviet bloc countries and translated previously unavailable information on, such things as life history parameters, physiological, ecological tolerances, invasion history, and impact severity. Now, using a conservative statistical model, which has been widely used by Kohler and Lodge and other workers, they identified from this study 28 potentially invasive species if they are successfully introduced into the Great Lakes. The Snyder study identified 10 very high-risk species, and by risk, I'm talking in the context of environmental risk. And what they did is they looked at the literature values for maximum salinity tolerances of these species. And based on this assessment, they identified 4 species of high invasive potential, 4 lower potential, and 2 no potential for invasion based on their maximum salinity tolerances. And this was based on the fact that these high-risk invasive species had sustained salinity tolerances greater than 28 parts per thousand. So right now, this high-risk list is currently being revised and reanalyzed based on some new information, newly translated information from Snyder, and some new information from McIsaac et al., published in 2015. So what I wanted to present here was the species of highest risk for ballast invasion, and I wanted to point out all the 10 species that I'm going to be illustrating here also have the capability of high environmental impact should they be successfully introduced. So of the 10 species that I'm going to be talking about, the big scale sand smelt, or it's also called Black Sea silversides, Aetheriana boyeri, was identified as the highest invasion risk of the 10 species because it inhabits freshwater to full-strength seawater, has a maximum salinity tolerance of 77 parts per thousand, and it also has had a large number of potential ballast discharge events, more than 6,400, according to some new information from McIsaac et al. However, the black striped pipefish, which we identified as a high-risk species, there was some question made because of the lower number of ballast discharge events that it may not be a high-risk species. It has also never been observed in ballast water. However, it has been hypothesized that one mechanism of spread in some of the riverine systems of Europe has been ballast, but again, no direct observation. However, a congeneric species, I think it's Nielsen's pipefish, has been found in ballast water. And another thing that we have to consider here is the fact that the black striped pipefish continues its onward march and range expansion into foreign ports, so it still could be considered a high ballast risk species. And just to give you a little bit of a flavor on how to identify the brook silversides, which is native to the Great Lakes, versus the big scale sand smelt, also called Black Sea silversides. And I hate these common names because they're very confusing. And the best way to successfully identify the two species in surveillance problem is look at the eye diameter relative to the snout length. And we see that on the Black Sea silversides, the eye diameter is much larger than the smelt or the snout length versus that in the brook silversides. Also, along the lateral line of the Black Sea silver sides, a series of longitudinal dots. So that's another key characteristic to look for in surveillance programs. Next, monkey goby, which we originally identified as a high ballast risk species. We've, based on some new information from MacIsaac, they identified only less than 250 potential ballast discharge events. However, Snyder et al., we have considered to remain a high ballast risk simply because of its high maximum salinity tolerance of 46 parts per thousand. It has extremely high dispersal rates, and it is also undergoing continued range expansion in the Danube River and Baltic ports. And surprisingly enough, this goby can reach about 8 inches in length and is also capable of hybridizing with round goby, which poses another interesting challenge should they get introduced here. And I want to just quickly go over the key identification features of these closely related species. And what you look for essentially in these goby species are the scaling patterns in the neck area, with both the anterior and posterior portion of the monkey goby being heavily scaled, whereas in the round goby, only the anterior portion is heavily scaled. You can also look at the shape of the dorsal fins between the two. There's a much sharper, much more linear decline in the length of the dorsal fin rays in the monkey goby versus that of the round goby. Also in the round goby, you will have a distinctive black spot on the the predorsal fin, which is absent in the monkey goby. You'll also note the pelvic disc on the monkey goby extends to the vent area, which it only reaches part way on the round goby. So that's obviously those are some key characteristics, and there are also a series of longitudinal lines along the side of the monkey goby, which are much more distinctive in that species versus those in the round goby. So obviously these are key characteristics that should be brought out to surveillance teams. So looking at the original study of Snyder et al. 2014, I think there's general agreement between Snyder and MacIsaac that of the 10 species, or actually of the 4 species originally identified as high risk, the big scale sand smelt is probably a high invasion risk. And there seems to be maybe some question over the capability of monkey goby as being a high invasion risk, but we would raise the issue of continued range expansion of both the monkey goby and black striped pipefish. And I should have mentioned earlier that the black striped pipefish is actually a freshwater seahorse. It has a long, slender body with bony rings. It also has a brood pouch in which the eggs develop. And from what I understand about this species, it can produce an egg brood within about 8 days. And they inhabit inshore areas and heavily vegetated areas where they prey on invertebrates and small fish. Now, and I just want to point out here, these are lower ballast risk species identified both by Snyder and by MacIsaac in terms of their range expansion, the number of potential shipping sources to the Great Lakes, the number of ballast or potential ballast discharges, and a more limited or borderline salinity tolerance. And I think we're talking about salinity tolerances within the range of 17 to low 20s parts per thousand. Now, originally on the Snyder study, we identified the Caspian sea kilka as being a high-risk species because it has a maximum salinity tolerance of 36 parts per thousand. But again, reanalyzing the literature, there's been very little range expansion of this species, and hence is probably deemed at a much lower ballast invasion risk. as is some of these other species. Now, the two sprat species, the two Clupionella species, the taxonomic status is somewhat in question, and I think in some of the European literature they're used interchangeably, and suffice it to say, I think we can call them either the same species or a subspecies, because morphologically the only difference is the length of the pelvic fins. I think they're about 3% longer in the Caspian version versus the black Caspian version here. Maximum salinity tolerance of this species is actually somewhat lower. There's also the black sea shad, which is a close relative of the alewife, has a much lower salinity tolerance. And I should have pointed out earlier that these asterisks next to the names of the species were newly identified by Snyder et al. There are several species of gobies which have been identified in previous studies as being potentially nasty or pernicious if they get introduced into the Great Lakes. However, the Volga dwarf goby and the Caspian big head goby have actually moderate salinity tolerances, again down to 17 to 20 parts per thousand, and are deemed perhaps much less likely to be successfully introduced by ship ballast. Now, of two species in particular which were evaluated as very low-risk species, and we're talking a maximum salinity tolerance of these species being, 12 to 14 parts per thousand, even though they've had extremely high number of potential ballast discharge events, we haven't seen these shown up. So they're very unlikely to be ballast-borne. However, the Eurasian minnow is commonly sold by the aquarium trade and in bait sales. The Eurasian or European perch, it is an aquaculture species in Europe and Eurasia, and it doesn't seem likely that this species could be introduced only as an aquarium trade, although the possibility exists for live fish sales and subsequent transport to North America. Interestingly enough, Eurasian or European perch have been sold by unscrupulous fish markets in the Great Lakes, selling them as the yellow perch, and they're much cheaper than the yellow perch. So the question of aquaculture being a vector is pretty questionable. And in terms of successfully identifying the European versus the yellow perch, it's extraordinarily difficult. It entails a dissection of some of the dorsal spine areas here and the arrangement of the predorsal bones and these pterygophores, which interdigitate with the vertebrae. It's extremely difficult. And there's some workers that are claiming that European perch and yellow perch may be either subspecies or the same species. So a lot of question there. So we've seen that a lot of previous studies have used very conservative risk models. There's been several. And from the original study, we originally identified 4 species classified as high ballast risks because they had maximum salinity tolerances greater than 28 parts per thousand at all ice stages, and those were the sand smelt, pipefish, and monkey goby. However, because of the low range distribution and lack of shipping sources, the Caspian kilka can be crossed off, and the list now downgraded to probably 3 species based on the new information. So based on the new information from McIsaac et al., the number of potential ballast discharge events that combined with ballast water exchange may severely limit the ability of Ponto-Caspian fish to be successfully introduced. And I think in general, ballast water is not a particularly effective way of introducing fish. It is much more so for invertebrates. According to McIsaac et al., because of the lower potential ballast discharges, monkey, goby, and black striped pipefish, their view was the invasion risk was lower. However, we point out that based on some newly translated literature, the range expansion of the high salinity tolerance species, such as monkey, goby, and the pipefish, does continue in the European rivers and ports. However, we still don't know what the actual densities are of those species. So I guess in general here, we, using conservative risk models and this new approach, looking at potential discharge events, you certainly have to consider, the number of discharge events, the efficacy of ballast water exchange, the acute versus chronic capabilities of salinity exposure of these species, their range expansion and natural densities and life stages in foreign ports. The latter, of course, being relatively unknown at this point. So what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about, some of these high-risk species and where we should be looking for them. We do know that there are European ports with significant shipping traffic to the Great Lakes, which have been listed here. And we know there are a number of Great Lakes ports at high risk from invasive Ponto-Caspian species. And Duluth, Minnesota being probably the most important, one of the most important ones, which I'll be looking at shortly. However, one thing I'd like to point out, there's no correspondence between these ports over here and here. So let's take a look at Duluth, Minnesota as an example, because the habitat and fish community have been fairly well described in that area. And in the original Snyder study, we identified surrogate species or indicator fish, which are quote unquote native, which share a lot of habitat, ecological, physiological tolerances very similar to these potentially invasive species. And since there's general agreement that the big-scale sand smelt probably poses the highest risk of those 10 species, that species, the indicator species would include the juvenile gizzard shad, brook silversides, again because of the similar morphology as well, the emerald shiner, and the spot-tail shiner. So EPA has done an excellent job at describing different habitat areas in the Duluth Superior Harbor. Now, using this as a model, Louis Berlicolo was actually able to develop this map on where the preferred locations of big-scale sand smelt based on the habitat match and the presence of native indicator species. And as you can see from this model here, a considerable portion of the Duluth harbor could be potentially colonized by the big-scale sand smelt should it make its way over here in a ballast tank. So I guess I guess some final comments I have here. Although we're seeing the door close a little bit on, actually quite a bit on ballast water, we should not ignore other potential invasion sources such as the bait industry, possibly aquaculture, and the aquarium sales. And of course, we need a lot more data on natural densities, seasonalities of life stages, number of potential ballast discharges, and acute and chronic salinity tolerances. We need a lot more work on these particular areas. And I think also very important with these potentially looming on the horizon, we need to obtain some voucher specimens from the EU, and from those develop some detailed identification teams for invasive species surveillance teams, and as such revise our watch list for high-risk invasive species. As we've seen from that example of Duluth Harbor, we need to consider monitoring habitats of the indicator species in Great Lakes ports that do, in fact, receive considerable international shipping. And I think in recent years, we've seen some major successes in the use of eDNA tools in terms of locating fish species as well as other potential invasive species, and utilizing these eDNA tools to identify the potential invasive species and also locate their native indicator species. So with that, thank you very much, and really appreciate the opportunity. By the way, I should point out I got this Russian from Google Translation, and I'm hoping that it's correct. It's supposed to say thank you very much, and appreciate your time. So thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I can open this up for questions.